scholars for our most recent webinar episode on Confucius Classrooms and foreign influence in education. I'll be your moderator. I'm Dr. Ian Oxnevad, and am the NAS Fellow for Foreign Affairs and Security Studies at NAS. We have a special guest today who has spearheaded efforts to highlight influence from the Chinese government in the American K-12 education system. With us today is Nicole Neily. She is the president and founder of Parents Defending Education. Parents Defending Education recently released a report this past July documenting the proliferation of a program called Confucius Classrooms around the country, and came to some fairly concerning assessments related to Chinese influence at the K-12 level, and also just proximity to things like Air Force bases and other sensitive installations pertaining to national security. So with that, let me welcome Nicole, and let's start out by you telling us a little bit about how Parents Defending Education came to an awareness of the Chinese government's influence in our education system.
Sure. So this started, as most of our investigations do, through our tip line. We had a parent from whose child had attended Thomas Jefferson School for Science and Technology in Fairfax, and she gave one of my coworkers a bunch of old annual reports from TJ, which included a lot of donations that were listed at the beginning through the partnership fund. And she said, "Isn't this weird that there's so much Chinese money flowing in?" And we thought, yeah, that is weird. So we started digging, kind of putting things together, looking at other back issues of school documents. And it turned out we were able to uncover over $1 million that came directly from the Chinese government linked entities to TJ. And in speaking to former members of the school board, school association, one person told us that in exchange for these donations, that the Chinese officials were allowed to, quote, look under the hood. They had access to everything. They had access to floor plans, lesson plans, student research projects. And she said, this just all felt very weird. And we thought, you know what, that is weird. And so we did the initial report on TJ and what we found there. But after that came out, which was well received and people were kind of horrified by that, we thought, well, if this is taking place here, is this taking place elsewhere? And it turns out, yes, it is. My colleague, Brian Staley, spent months and months and months sending dozens of public records requests across the country to other schools that we identified, basically doing a spiderweb research project, trying to figure out, okay, all these projects had been identified many years ago through the work of people like you, but also Congressional Research Service and other places had documented and looked at this. And as you may remember, Secretaries Pompeo and Secretary DeVos really took this issue head on during the Trump administration, but those efforts fizzled out when the Biden administration took over. And so we wanted to see, where does the state of this now? Where are these programs currently operational? And, what exactly is going on? What did these contracts say? How much money was changing hands? Because as you and I know, there is transparency mandated in higher education donations from foreign countries, but not in the K-12 area. And that, to me, is a huge gap and a real opportunity for policymakers to step up and to close this loophole.
Interesting. So when you were doing these investigations in terms of your findings, like what did you see in terms of the actual influence? Was this textbooks? Were these teachers? Were these field trips? How did this sort of management of the actual Confucius classrooms happen in terms of government influence from China?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it really is, it's a little bit of everything, depending on the school, depending on, the contracts would indicate different things. In some instances, there would be teachers that came over that were teaching. And so kind of like an in-kind donation, right? You're getting free labor, a teacher who is a native Mandarin speaker that is teaching. Unfortunately, given how the Chinese education system works, given how, even the process to get a visa to leave China, you have to, have to be a solid party member to come over. And so that's one concern. But in some contracts that we saw, there was curriculum that was provided either by universities in China or through Confucius Institute partners here at some of those university hubs that I know NAS has done a great job of documenting. But there were teachers that went over also to China for a series of junkets as well, students that went over. And so there was a flow of information back and forth. But it is, I would consider that a soft power exercise, right? It's creating kind of warm and fuzzy feelings while also presenting what is likely a pretty slanted view of Chinese culture, Chinese history. As much as we hear people like Randy Weingarten talking about teaching true history, what kind of true history we're getting, or children getting, when it comes to the People's Republic of China? Are they learning about Tiananmen, Tibet? Are they learning about the Uyghurs? Almost certainly not. And so these are things that I think is of great concern to parents. And where we came into this is that, if parents are okay with their child learning something like that, that's fine. But our concern is that most parents have no idea that this money, that these curriculum, that these teachers are coming over. And so parents are not able to make informed decisions about whether they want their children to participate in these programs or not.
Yeah, so you bring up like an interesting point here with parents, because education over the past, well, certainly since COVID, has become such a hot button issue nationally in a way that I think 15 years ago would have been inconceivable. With different aspects of curriculum, whether it be about the sexualization of materials or other issues, disciplinary issues in the classroom. How did the issue of Chinese government influence fit among all the concerns that parents had? Was this something that readily registered and that came to the forefront, or was this just one more aspect of the sense that education has gone wrong somewhere?
It is just one more aspect. I mean, certainly this one parent in Fairfax had flagged this as something that struck her as very odd. But this is something we have been tracking, just money flowing into America's public schools since our founding. We released a report in 2021 looking at different consultants that school districts have hired, largely on the equity front, although now we're seeing a lot of gender consultants operate in schools, where they'll go in, they'll do something called an equity audit. Unsurprisingly, 100% of the time, they will say, hey, the district is racist. The way to be less racist is to hire me in perpetuity. And so we've seen that happening. We've also seen funding coming into schools from foundations, from places like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, from the Gates Foundation, from various other left-leaning foundations, where they are pushing. They have a worldview. They are pushing equity. They are pushing. The Gates Foundation is very big into math equity, which is something that you didn't even really think would be a thing, but it turns out it is. And so the amount of money and influence flowing in, to me, it kind of, I'm not surprised that our children are not spending as much time learning core subjects when there is so much else that is being pushed down their throat. Just this week, we saw that California announced that they're going to push media literacy to teach children how to discern what fake news is. This is on top of the ethnic studies mandate that we have in California. What time is there left in the school day for a child to learn reading, writing, and arithmetic when they have that? But then they also have social emotional learning and all these other topics. I think, in a larger sense, what is worrisome is that we're watching the American school system be transformed into something that is not able to compete with its international adversaries, be it China, be it India, be it England or anywhere else. Our children are not learning the skills that they need to thrive in a global marketplace.
So you raised two things. Did you come across any equivalent influence from any other government other than China, or is China the only government doing this that you sort of tripped over?
We have, in some of the documents that we've received, have found other questionable things that we're chasing down right now. In 2017, the Wall Street Journal actually did a report on the Qatar Foundation and their funding of Arabic language programs, which is something that over the past month has certainly become increasingly salient as we see how the Israel-Hamas war is being framed in different school systems. This has certainly been a problem for many years in universities and is now also a problem in K-12 schools. One FOIA that I received from the Fairfax County Public Schools. Also, we saw some inquiries from the Skolkovo Foundation in Russia, which is tied to Dmitry Medvedev. I'm still waiting on some documents to come back from them. But I think it basically feels like a lot of American schools kind of hung up a shingle and said open for business. And that's very weird. That's very questionable that American schools are sort of selling their IP to these foreign countries while also giving them access to everything we have done. Why would we do that? Why would we want to do that?
Right. That's interesting. You brought up the Arabic program parallel, because I went through a program like that, and it wasn't nearly as politicized as some of the Chinese language material that comes out of China. This was 10 years ago or so. But so when you raised your concerns, did you come across anyone in the school system itself that was concerned about this? Or was this just sort of, this is what we're doing to cut costs and make ourselves more attractive?
Sadly, it was the latter. It was, we got a free teacher, we got a free program. And, this is certainly, and this is not to say that foreign language programs, foreign culture programs are bad whatsoever. I have a minor in French. I'm half Japanese. We want children to have cross-cultural understanding. But I think where the rubber hits the road is, what are our children learning, and what are the teachers, where are they coming from? What is their worldview? We have worries about American teachers pushing their worldview on children. And I contrast that with, an anecdote I heard about Thomas Sowell many years ago when he was a professor at Stanford, and he had a student come up to him at the end of a semester and say, I don't really know what your perspective is on these things. And I think he wrote in one of his memoirs, it was one of my prouder moments as a teacher. I mean, contrast that with what we're seeing in American schools today. Of course, teachers want you to know. They want you to know all about, their sexuality and their worldview and their politics and who they voted for. Our children don't need that. Our children are there to learn finite subjects. They're not there to absorb everything from, they're to become little automatons and become, they're what their teachers want them to be.
Yeah. With the data on China specifically, did you come across any trend in terms of how China sought to place these programs, or how was it public schools, private schools, charter schools? Were they targeting major cities and population centers with that, or was it just basically anyone who would take a program?
Well, there were a number of the top schools around the country, which was one thing that kind of stood out to us. Thomas Jefferson School for Science and Technology is no longer America's #1 magnet school in the country. But there were other programs. There was a North Carolina School for Science and Technology. North Carolina School of Science and Mathematics, the Simpson County Public School System. So other good top STEM schools was something that stood out to us, as well as the fact that there were a number of them that were clustered on military bases. And that to us also stood out as something that merits further investigation. So we have gone to federal lawmakers begging them to investigate this, governors asking, please get a handle on what is going on, ask questions of these school systems and figure out who was there, what they had access to, and what the decision-making process was in all this. Because as far as we could tell, it was, as you said, very much this is great, free, free classroom, free money, free whatever.
Right. Right. So you talk about funding a lot. How are the Confucius classrooms funded? What was the relationship between school administration, the actual program itself, the teachers? Were there nonprofits that were middlemen? Were there corporate donors involved, or even local policymakers at the state or local level who helped facilitate this? Can you sort of describe the ecosystem in like a composite?
It was, it was funny because my coworker started to make a flow chart kind of the money going back and forth. And by the end, we kind of looked like that meme of the guy with the strings on the wall because stuff was going back and forth between everywhere. In some districts, there was money flowing from Confucius Institutes from at the universities to the K-12 districts. In some places, there would be the districts paying the Confucius Institutes. There were nonprofits as middlemen. The Asia Society was one of them. And then in Thomas Jefferson, there were some businesses. There was the Amison Education and Ambright Education, which were two businesses, as well as links to universities over in China, like Tsinghua University. And so we compared this to the Australian Strategic Studies Institute. They have a list of kind of who's working with the Chinese military, and we're able to identify that weirdly a lot of the programs, a lot of the Chinese universities, if they were sending over curriculum, if they were sending over teachers, that they were tied to the Chinese military, which again starts to raise many questions. But it did feel like a lot of this was very intentionally confusing. There was not any one way that money was flowing back and forth. And so that to us felt like it was a lot. There were some red flags there, that this was intended to be something that was hard to trace.
Right. What kind of amounts of money are we talking about?
Interestingly, the sums were pretty low. And this is something that I think, as we are urging policymakers to get involved on this, is something that I have flagged for them. The Higher Education Act requires reporting of foreign gifts above $250,000. Many of the gifts that we saw were at or below $50,000. Again, this is, setting aside the fact that teachers were coming up, teacher salaries, were not accounted for. And so there were what I would consider an in-kind donation almost. But the dollar figures themselves were pretty low. And so when we released this report, we had some people say, well, this is, it was, I think what was the total amount was $17 million over like a 10-year period. It doesn't sound like a lot, but there were a lot of transactions and a lot of other goods and services that were moving back and forth. And so I think that in and of itself is something that is worth bearing in mind as policymakers continue to figure out how to address this problem.
What about intangible gifts that were non-monetary? Were there any intangible gifts that you found when you were looking at this in terms of how school districts were swayed or massaged into opening these programs?
I think, all expenses paid trip to China is something that is really exciting and appealing. We have recently received some public records back from Fairfax County Public Schools about the then principal at the time of TJ, Evan Glazer. He was wined and dined and taken on junkets around the country. That's something that's very appealing for somebody in a public school salary. And so let's not discount that too, right? I mean, this is soft power. It is making someone just a little bit more favorable to one worldview than another. And so I think, while we didn't see lavish gifts being, showered on districts, or we haven't yet any from proof of that, I should say. I do think that just the fact that, teachers getting to go over for a week, that does impact them. And certainly we see lots of other countries do this. When I worked at a think tank, I know, different governments will invite, policy professionals to go to Germany or Switzerland or places like that. And it is, they want you to like their country. They want you to like their political party or whatever. And this is something that is worth bearing in mind, because that does impact how people and teachers and education systems will teach these topics in the future.
Right. What was the role of state and local officials in setting these up? Was there any pushback, or did they help facilitate these programs?
The fact that a lot of this ran through the universities, public universities for a large part, I think, is something that state policymakers do and should have a role in. I'm surprised that a lot of the state education agencies didn't have a better handle on this or really weren't aware of it. I have been, frankly, particularly disappointed in the state of Virginia because beginning with our investigation to TJ in March, we had reached out to the Secretary of Education, the governor, and the Attorney General asking them to investigate this. Thomas Jefferson eventually did release their own internal report on TJ. And they said, you know what? It was actually $3.6 million that we got from China. It wasn't $1 million like PDE had identified, but they didn't release the results of that report. We haven't seen contracts yet. I'm still waiting on that. I just paid $3,800 for those contracts. And so the fact that there has been, frankly, a tepid response from state policymakers when education is fundamentally K-12 education is fundamentally a state and a local issue, something that's really deeply disappointing.
Right. For those of you who just joined us, please do add your questions to the Q&A. We'll get to those at the end. It's at the bottom of your screen, I believe. So just putting that out there. When you mention how they were targeting or seemed to have been targeting China, these schools around Air Force bases and military bases, did you see any other sort of systematic targeting of trying to put programs at schools of different rankings? Was there, the top 10 schools in the US, did they all have these programs, or is this something that just seemed agnostic on the part of China setting them up and schools taking them?
It seemed agnostic. I mean, we did identify 34 schools plus DC. But as we made clear when we released the report in July, this is very likely only the tip of the iceberg. We went through the Asia Society's 990s. We went through the pathways that we had identified where money came in. As we got contracts back, we would then send out new public records requests. But I'm sure there are other avenues and other ways that money has been coming in. I mean, I'm not sure if I didn't have access to the Thomas Jefferson annual report, I would not have known that Ambright Education Group was a player that I should be looking for, a name that I should have flagged. And so I think that there is a lot more out there that we just don't know about. And so we have requested, as we've been publicizing this, for people to send along tips. It doesn't have to be, this is a program that is currently in our school now. It could be something that they found from 10 years ago. My daughter went through this program in her school. I have some questions, something felt weird. And so all tips that are sent to us are anonymous. We chase things down. We will file our own records request. We will, speak to school officials if needed. But I do think that there's a lot more out there that we as a country just don't have a grasp on.
Right. In terms of, you're going to just guess, how many students in general do you think have gone through these programs or are currently in them?
Oh, that's hard. And I mean, again, these programs, once they're set up, it's, maybe a Chinese language program was set up at a school. A teacher was there for 2 years. The program continued for 6 years. And then they had another teacher come in who was not funded by the Chinese government. And so I think it's hard to really come up with a firm number of students that have been impacted by this. But the fact is, I mean, I know in research that you have done from years ago, you had identified, I would say 500 schools across the country, K-12 schools that had used these programs. Or was that higher ed?
Well, so the Confucius Classrooms, that was a number that the federal government came out with. Okay. And we actually looked for that, and I'm still looking for it. where that number actually comes up. And that just seems to be a number that they pulled out of nowhere based on the internal documentation that we've done at the K through 12 level and also in what you've done. My guess would be that if you include individual schools, it's about 500, because you're talking about districts often with many schools that are separate. But depending on where you draw that institutional line, I would probably say that it's about 500.
Yeah.
Roughly.
And so, we know that these programs have been in America going back at least 10 years. But the number of students in any particular program at any school at any given time, it could be 10 students, it could be like 50 students or 100 students. So I think the number could be very large. But I watched a video that I'm sure you've seen about how these programs have manifested at the university level. There was a video of a student singing a Chinese or a Mandarin opera at the University of Michigan in 2016. And it's an ode to how great Chairman Mao was. And all the parents in the audience, you can imagine, are just sitting there kind of nodding because no one really speaks Mandarin except for the kids who are in the program. And so these parents don't know that they have just paid thousands of dollars for their child to get, a master's degree, a bachelor's degree, a minor in Mandarin, and yet to be singing the praises of someone who's responsible for the death of 40 million Chinese. That's appalling. And so I can only imagine what is taking place at younger ages.
Right. So have you seen any effects? Like, is the soft power working? Like, do you have any assessment of whether or not that's working? Because, you see prevalence of students and younger Americans. I think Pew Research just did a thing that came out, and a third of younger Americans get their news from TikTok. Obviously that's one instrument because it's owned by ByteDance, which is owned by the Chinese government. But with these programs and specifically, have you seen is it paying off for China doing this, or are they just teaching, students Mandarin, and the students are seemingly cluelessly going away with that skill, but not actually taking the bait?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I have not seen polling on students, and we as an organization don't poll students, nor do we, we don't use children as child soldiers the way that I think our opponents do for the most part. But I think, what we can see kind of as a corollary is student attitudes, which have been polled recently about the Israel-Hamas conflict, right? The fact that so many young people now think that, Hamas is not terrible, they're out there marching in the streets. I think that is kind of the culmination of many, many years of Qatar's soft power exercise, efforts. And so I suspect that if similar polling were to be done on China, Taiwan, I worry that things would start to tip very quickly in a direction that most Americans would not like and not be comfortable with. And so, what is taking place in classrooms, in addition to what is happening on social media, I think is really making for a toxic stew that in a few years is going to be something that is absolutely untenable for us as a country.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot can change. China's got some massive economic problems of its own. So going back to your report, how much of a bombshell was that in terms of pushback or responses from schools? Did schools start shutting these down or taking efforts to distance themselves, like what happened with our Confucius Institutes report?
Well, yes and no. We identified only, I think at the end of the day, 7 programs that were still fully operational as of July 2023, one of which was Tulsa Public Schools, and the Oklahoma Secretary of Education, Ryan Walters, state superintendent, took them on head on, and they were pretty unabashed about it. But I think a lot of the other ones were kind of taken by surprise that this was something that people had any problem with. And so we hope that, community members there kind of take the ball and run with it and say, we're not comfortable with this. We like the program, but we prefer you get the teachers from Taiwan in the future, or, or something like that. Again, we have had very few policymakers actually step in the way that we saw during the Trump administration. But fortunately, Congress does seem to have some kind of an appetite for it. They had a hearing in September on the K-12 issue, and I'm sure there will be more of those to follow. The China Select Committee, this is like yet one of the many issues that they are looking at. And so I think it is something that is going to continue to be kind of at a low simmer. And I can't wait until your report comes out, because I think that is going to really just remind people this is something that we have to keep our foot on the gas about. There are so many issues competing for people's attention, but we are competing against a country that has a 50-year plan, whereas, America kind of goes every 2 years, 4 years electoral cycle. And we do not have, I think, a full grasp of the kind of adversary we're up against, much less an appetite to engage on it.
Right. What has been the local response of parents and school boards since this report has come out? Have you seen an upswell of reform efforts related to this as opposed to just everything else that's happened with education over the past 3 years?
Right. Of the 143 districts that we had identified in our report, we did have other people come to us from both from those districts as well as other ones, offering to provide information, things that they had seen, things that they were questionable about, and so that they were questioning. And so we continue to chase those down to figure out kind of what else we can add into this. If there are other threads we can follow, like I said, going after, well, that's an interesting corporation to use as a middleman. Oh, that's a new foundation we hadn't heard of. And so there is an appetite for that. But again, we're competing for parents' finite bandwidth. They're realizing that their kids are not safe, their kids are not learning. They worry about gender issues, they worry about race issues. And so I think it's an issue that is of concern, but it speaks to a larger problem with America's public school system in that trust is shattered completely. These schools have been very badly run for many years. They demand more and more money. The quality and the results they're delivering are worse and worse and worse. And so I think this is kind of just another data point for parents, for the most part. But there are some people who have really have been galvanized by this. And so I think it's, there is not kind of a universal response, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of the language program itself, oftentimes there's ancillary programs to that may involve other activities, or maybe even it's the sciences in some cases. Have you seen anything related to that in China as a corollary to these programs?
Well, one interesting thing that we found from Thomas Jefferson was that it really does appear to have just been kind of a flagrant attempt to just rip off all of the IP from Thomas Jefferson. There were former school officials, as well as current school officials, that went back and forth to China. They were trying to hire, and there is now actually a series of schools in China called the Thomas schools, down to basically the logo being the exact same. And so that in and of itself is fascinating. They had all these groups of teachers coming over from China to look at TJ, do tours. I mean, I don't even know how the teachers at TJ had any time to actually teach the students for this period of time, because they were constantly entertaining delegations coming through. We worked with some friends running the names of the different teachers that were coming through. They were all party officials. And again, they were asking for floor plans. They wanted lesson plans. They wanted, they really wanted, how do we replicate this model overseas? And so the fact that they have taken that model, there are now, dozens of Thomas schools across China. And yet now TJ itself is so mired in equity fights that it has dropped in the rankings nationwide, that it is not able to compete against Thomas schools internationally. I mean, that to me is jaw-dropping, and really heartbreaking too.
So when you say floor plans, they actually wanted the blueprints and the architecture plans?
Yes, like the layouts of the labs, like things like that. And they were provided. I mean, our schools, our taxpayer-funded education officials turn those over to foreign nationals. That's weird to me. Why is nobody asking questions about that?
That is weird. The fact that they wanted the actual blueprints.
Yeah.
I mean, so have you had any evidence of these actual cookie cutter programs with the exact same floor plans popping up in China? Or is there other speculations of why they'd want the floor plans?
Unfortunately, I don't speak Mandarin, so I have not been able to really dig into it as much on that end as I would like to. But I do think this is something that is worth, if our federal government weren't so tied up in doing kind of other things, this I think is something that is worth pursuing.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's the most mimetic lack of creativity you can imagine, where they'd actually want the same floor plans. That's fascinating. Yeah, Harvard. The reason I asked about the science aspect of this, because Harvard has been working with Tsinghua University since 1993. And for those of you who don't know, Tsinghua University is very closely tied to the Chinese military. It involves its nuclear weapons program and cybernetics and cyber warfare and all these things. And it's been tied to, cyber attacks on state governments and allied countries and private corporations. And yet Harvard's been working with them since 1993. That's crazy. What about pushback, going back to your report, have you seen, what was the response from these other organizations? Because you mentioned middlemen, corporations in some cases, nonprofits. How have they responded? What's been their response to your report?
None of them seem to have responded to any questions that reporters reached out to them on. And so I guess I'm not surprised on that front. But, if anything, the response that we have gotten in America has been that, well, this is just racist. This is just anti-Asian racism, which to me is frankly kind of a tired trope. I am half Japanese. I don't hate Asian people, but also I think it's a distraction. It's a deflection because it means that you're not engaging on the merits. You're just not making ad hominem attacks. And so we should be questioning, we should be wondering where and why is this happening and how are we going to address in the future so that there is greater transparency and greater oversight of what's taking place. And so just to say racism, nothing to see here, move along, I think does a disservice to our American education system and to our children.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it doesn't also bring up the fact that there's actually two Chinas, not just one.
Right.
Has there been any effort to replace these programs with an alternative, maybe based out of Singapore or based out of Taiwan? I know recently the Asia Society sort of rebranded and worked to revamp their Mandarin language program. It's kind of new, but I'm curious as to know what's filling the vacuum, if anything, with these with these programs.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it is not that all 143 districts that we identified have shut down their Chinese language programs altogether. So I assume that they have been replaced by other teachers that are just, the contracts have been cut off. But again, the contract being cut off with, let's say, Western Kentucky University doesn't mean that the teachers still are not coming from China. Maybe they're just coming through a private company. And so it's
they are actually with Western Kentucky.
It's really hard to track, and it's really scary that this is happening.
Right. No, of course. So your guess would be that the Mandarin language programs themselves have largely survived, even if the teachers have cycled out, and the Chinese, from Beijing at least, from that money's not there anymore, but other money might be there.
Right. I think almost certainly other money is probably there in a lot of these places.
Okay. What follow-up questions have you come up with, as opposed to, and I promise, not to take any of them, but I'm curious, what other questions does this pose, the findings that you've had from, this investigation?
Sure. I think, one was, where else what other adversarial countries are doing this besides China? And so that is one thing that we'll be chasing down in 2024 is digging more into the Qatar connection. But beyond that, I mean, I think, it's getting your arms around the extent of it. I mean, I know this is kind of, you have been wrapping your arms around this for a year, and it is so hairy, and you kind of go down these little rabbit holes trying to figure out, all right, well, this person and this, and so it's, we still continue to receive tips. We still continue to try and add to this report and figure out, okay, this is longer than maybe we initially had. We only got documents for this time period, but it looks like something else. And so trying to continue to build it out, as well as just to keep up the pressure on policymakers at the state and federal level, asking and demanding and expecting that they take action on this, that this is something that is a serious threat, is a serious problem, and that we're not going to just say, all right, this is not just the flavor of the week, time to move on. That and there should be bipartisan agreement on addressing and closing some of these loopholes. I mean, the fact that there's transparency in higher ed, but not K-12, why? I mean, there's kind of no excuse for that. And so fix it. And while you're at it, fix the Higher Education Act and lower the reporting threshold there too.
I hate to say, but the rabbit hole just keeps going. I wish that it didn't, and it goes to multiple places. You dig the hole and you don't just come out in China on the other end. It goes to multiple places. Yeah. Unfortunately. Okay. That's good.
Yeah. But if anybody, who's watching, has any ideas, or they see other things that they think are worth investigating, we encourage people to send us tips. Our website is defendinged.org, and they can send things anonymously, just a hyperlink, or just say, hey, it looks like Montgomery County Public Schools might be up to some fishy stuff on the Confucius front. Check it out. And we love to dig into stuff like that. I have terrific researchers. Like I said, my coworker, Ryan Staley, I mean, it gives him a dopamine rush to find all this stuff. And so we're we are committed to finding and outing this because we firmly believe that sunshine is the best disinfectant. People can give us tips anonymously. Their names will never be connected to it. We will be the bad guys. We will take the slings and arrows because we really think that people deserve to know this information so they can decide whether it's a program that they want their children to be enrolled in or not.
Right. Have you developed a policy platform for this, or it's kind of nationwide, or is this any policy recommendations that you actually have? Are they focused more at this, state or local level? And what are those recommendations other than just the reporting requirements?
Sure. And well, I think what the scary thing is, we kind of don't know what we don't know. We had been challenged by some reporters saying, well, what's your proof that information is being stolen from students and sent back to China? We have never said that we have proof of that, but there are questions, right? If a teacher who has come from China that is a Communist Party official has access to a school server, then they have access to a lot of student information. How are those schools firewalling or otherwise protecting data from foreign nationals? That's a question that a state education agency should be asking. State education agencies, governors, state boards of education should know whether foreign funding is coming in. And if that foreign funding is pushing out or causing schools to de-emphasize other programming. Are you cutting a German language program to make room for a Chinese language program? What is the decision-making process going into this? And so we have been encouraging everyone, please at least ask questions. Where is your intellectual curiosity on this? We see people who are so upset about farmland. What about your children's brains? What about the ideas and kind of their worldview on things? You should be concerned about that too. And so we have just begged them to open their own investigations into this.
Yeah, you kind of raise a point that I don't think anybody asks about TikTok. It's, in terms of great power competition, the idea of using TikTok to literally make the other side dumber. It seems like stupid as a strategy, but it somehow seems to be working, which is really sad. But yeah, it's interesting that you bring up the intellectual curiosity because there are other countries that have language programs and actually have different avenues of funding and ways to set those up and the infrastructure organizationally to implement those. I know India, for example, has been trying to figure out a way to get Hindi into the K-12 education system. And from an economic standpoint, it's just as important as Mandarin, but India is an emerging ally. So why is there no, Hindi language program as opposed to Mandarin, for example? And that's a question that I think needs to be asked by people who want to not just address the problem of the Chinese government putting these programs in, but also what do you replace them with?
Right. And I think, it's clever, right? And there is a strategy for this, right? This is kind of a continuation of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes.
And we're not seeing other countries engage in outreach and, engagement as strategically as we have seen the People's Republic of China do. And so there is an opportunity for friendly nations to get involved, as well as, we live in a hostile world. There are a lot of countries that wish us ill. So to both, kind of elevate people that we want to get to know better, and then also keep an eye on and make sure that, things are not happening like nefariously either.
Right. So a purely technocratic type of question. Studies have shown that American schools don't teach foreign language well. We don't even do well with Spanish, even though a good portion of the population in the US actually speaks Spanish as a heritage speaker or a native speaker. We don't teach it well. There's even been efforts from joint efforts by Spain and Mexico to put those programs in to try to build that up. With Mandarin specifically, is in just terms of language teaching, are these programs effective at all based on your findings or based on anything you've seen with parents?
I cannot speak to that. I am not sure. But I think, there are, other avenues as well, I think, that have started to come up that we are also keeping an eye on. Some of the ed tech platforms that are also Chinese owned, where there is a lot of data that some of these Chinese owned companies have access to beyond TikTok. Districts entering into partnerships with, is it tutor.com, I think is one of them. There are
Yeah, they've been buying a number of educational
right. So there are a couple companies where, I mean, even aside from the Chinese language, there is access to student data that is
Oh yeah,
intentionally purchased, and we don't know what's happening to that. And I think, the issue of data in school in and of itself is something that schools just don't manage well. I mean, I picture most school districts' data officers are kind of like the equivalent of someone who works at like the DMV. That should worry people. We have on average 2 school districts a day being hacked by malware, actors that are trying to just ransom money from districts, much less from countries that want to use our student data for who knows what reason.
right, right. No, it's true. I mean, low-level data, nobody talks about this, but low-level data on students or just private individuals, there's a kind of an emerging thing in poli-sci literature of talking about how what would happen if you targeted the population itself, not with, fire bombings like in Dresden, but with actual information operations. And what if you crashed everyone's credit history in mass? What would that do to a country? And just private individuals as opposed to a government. Targeting the data of millions of people at the same time. There's reason to be concerned with that. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to some questions from the audience. What are your plans for updating the report, or do you have any? Do you have an annual edition that you're planning to do,
Well,
or
we're pretty
anything?
young. We're not as old as you guys. We're not even 3 years old yet. But we are adding to it as we receive tips in. And again, we're chasing down, we continue to file public records about this. And so it is something that we are continuing to add to as new stuff comes in. I mean, my coworker right before I got on this said that he has a call scheduled next week with someone in Arizona from a district that we had identified in this report for that has additional information. And so it is very much a case of many hands making light work.
Right, right. No, that's good. Is there a way for parents who are concerned about this to stay in contact with each other and with your organization?
Yeah, definitely check out our website, defendinged.org. I have a dozen coworkers spread across the country who basically spend, 7 days a week on the phone or emailing with parents, addressing their needs, be it about this or be it about other questions they have about what's going on in K-12 programming. And so some of them want to be out front and they don't have a problem with their name being out there. A lot of parents, honestly, probably 99% of the tips we get, and people say they want to be anonymous. But there are people who run parent organizations, and we are more than happy to network people in with other parent advocates, parent activists in their state, in their city, so that they can find other people and share information with each other. Because as I said earlier, education is largely a state and local issue. And so if there's a great group of parents in Virginia or Maryland, them working together and then going to their state, that has more juice than me as like an evil Washingtonian saying something. So yeah, very much we're firm believers in those networks.
Right. Well, that's good. That's good. Another question that kind of relates to this. What is the role of foreign graduate students or college students? Is there any correlation between organizations like the CSSA and Confucius Classrooms?
I think you're probably better equipped to answer this than I am. I mean, the fact that so many of these programs in K-12 schools were tied to the university Confucius Institutes, I think is interesting, with the teachers, with some of the materials, trickling down from the universities to K-12. But I remember years ago speaking to a friend who's a reporter with the Washington Post when I was running a campus organization, and he said, some of the Chinese students who come over on foreign visas are actually reporting on some of their other Chinese classmates in America, sending information back. If they are engaging in pro-democracy work in America, then, that impacts their family back home. And so I think there is, aside from information flowing from China here, I think there is also information flowing back about, Chinese citizens and their activities, what they're doing and how that might impact their families back in China.
Right.
And so I think that's
Right.
something that's concerning.
Kind of a low-level espionage.
Yeah.
Going back to the military bases, did you see any cases of that where there seemed to be any actual espionage efforts, other than, nothing to worry about, spy balloons floating over? Was there anything that you saw related to military bases and the actual?
No, we did not find any specific like smoking guns on that front. But I mean, some of the places where the bases are in, they're not all in super great areas like Quantico that are sort of in urban areas. Like, some of them like are, like Fort Knox, Fort Bragg, Dover. I mean, these are places where like it's a military base and like that's it. My brother was in the Army. Some of these base communities are fairly remote and like that's kind of the only gig in town. And so to put a program there is a little bit unusual. It's, they're not top performing schools. There's a lot of turnover because of students recycling in and out as their family members are deployed or reassigned elsewhere. And so the fact that those were chosen as locations to put these programs just seemed unusual enough that we wanted to pull it out as kind of a sidebar.
Right. It's interesting because when we were collecting our own data set, it seemed like there were, students or these programs from, townships and villages that you'd never heard of. There, that you would never, unless you knew they were there. And it seemed to sort of raise the question of, it didn't seem organic with the way that these programs are built. It would seem like they would start in major cities, around major universities, trickle out from there. But that doesn't seem to be the case. They just seem to be everywhere. In terms of how many of these have closed and how many of them are still open, do you have any firm grasp of whether or not these are just still going on? I know you talked about some of these programs just sort of evolving, but have you found any method to track that?
We largely operated through public records requests, and looking, kind of comparing the 990s of the pass-through entities like Asia Society. But as you know, I mean, NAS has done terrific work on the College Board, right? And the College Board's role in some of this as well, which is something else that, I mean, you have played such an invaluable role in really pulling together all these different strings, because I think so many people, when they work in education policy, there's like sort of the usual suspect villains. All right, teachers unions, but the fact is that there are so many other, frankly, bad actors that are sort of working in lockstep with each other, I think is something that more people need a greater appreciation of. I think that's something that's really, worrisome.
Actually, you raise a really good question. Have there been any connections between the teachers unions and the Confucius Classrooms? Membership of the teachers that come over, or any sort of donations from the same nonprofits or anything like that?
That's a great question. Nothing stood out to us at the time, but it is something that I will absolutely tell my coworker to look into when we get off this.
I mean, because that would be very telling in and of itself, and even more systematic than setting up the little franchises around the country, because that would be a bigger
it's going to the top, right? It's more efficient that way.
Institutional capture. I mean, because that's obviously what the goal of soft power is, if you can capture an institution like teachers unions. And
right. I mean, well, all we need to do is look at the past couple of years of the NEA's annual meeting, at their resolutions that they vote on every year. I mean, almost none of them have to do with student success or any of those things. I mean, actually, a few years ago, they voted down a resolution to focus on student success. And that was at the same time as they were voting on changing the term mother to birthing person. It was like voting on, Ukraine and Palestine and abortion and all these, literally everything else except the job you were there to do. And so, frankly, I wouldn't be surprised. The NEA's budget is $372 million. The AFT's is, I want to say, $187 million. They have so much money coming in from all over the place. I cannot imagine Randy Weingarten being discerning about it coming from a foreign dictator.
right. Well, I mean, that raises the other question too, if the Chinese government is just as frustrated with teachers unions as
why can't you make this happen faster?
I mean, because that you'd probably be surprised at how frustrating those bureaucracies and institutions probably could be. They're not as efficient. That's the problem with authoritarian regimes. Authoritarian regimes are very efficient. They're very draconian, but once you get to the dysfunction, it starts to fall apart. So that'd be an interesting counterfactual to look at.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't see any other questions here from the audience. Is there any takeaways that you would like to leave with us over the last few minutes? We have plenty of time. We have
I mean, we did polling on this over the summer, just trying to get a sense of, how parents felt about this, how people felt about these. And this is, 87% of people felt that districts should be required to disclose when they accept money from foreign governments. So this is not something that is like a partisan issue. Like Republicans think yes, and Democrats, this is like 87% of Americans can't even agree on like whether we like ice cream, right? And so the fact that there are so many people that are all on board on that, I think is encouraging, right? And that should be kind of an additional push that moves policymakers in the right direction. 73% of people felt that it was inappropriate for schools to share student data with foreign governments that fund school programs. Again, like these are no-brainers. This is very, very easy. Like we should be able to move something through Congress on these things. And so, yes, we have had like a shutdown flirtation, but like this is the kind of thing that we should be able to move on to show that American policymakers actually do have students' best interest at heart.
Two questions, because you bring like privacy issues here. Has this raised any Fourth Amendment driven lawsuits over this, the sort of collection of data or anything like that? Because still, I mean, even if China is trying to collect the data, it's still going through an otherwise American institution bound by law. It would seem like that would be one avenue to explore.
Right. It's interesting. I have not heard anybody raise Fourth Amendment concerns, although I actually did have a call literally just yesterday with someone talking about student privacy. And she said there was a parent who was involved in his lawsuit and they spent like $25,000 on a FOIA trying to figure out who had their child's data. And the school couldn't answer it because so many different vendors had so much information. Then they broker it and they sell it back to each other. And so I think the fact that, what we think our children are learning, and even the fact that so much of it has moved online. I mean, we had in the course of our work, outing the National School Boards Association had identified a vendor called Panorama Education, where it's, there's a lot of information being gathered about students under the guise of social emotional learning and creating personalized education solutions. Well, we have spoken to a bunch of parents around the country who said they have been able to it's supposed to all be anonymized, but they have been able to kind of reverse engineer and figure out what students are responding to questions different ways. And so if parents can do that, certainly people who buy that data can do it as well. And so the quantity of people who are companies that are accessing student data, what happens to it, and then even the fact that most schools are not aware of something called the Protection of Pupil Rights Amendment, which governs the collection of student data on sensitive topics, politics, race, sex, drugs, etc. They don't even know that there is a law about that and that they have to give parents the option to opt out. I mean, I always opt my children out of all kinds of data collection, but there's so much more that's going on that I'm not even aware of, which is frightening.
Right. I mean, that's something to explore, the Fourth Amendment option.
Yeah.
That would be something to look at. Speaking of that, there's two questions here. They're kind of related. Are states doing any legislation to undo this? From foreign countries specifically? I know states have tried to take the forefront of a number of these things rather than the federal government, but do you see any model legislation taking place?
I have not seen any model legislation, although, Governor DeSantis did speak out. He took a little bit of action as he identified some schools that had been using, I think they had, maybe it was tutor.com, or maybe it was some of the online programs. And I think he had said if they didn't cut off contact with those programs, or they didn't cancel their contracts, the schools would not be eligible to participate in the state's school choice program. And so I think there are people who are kind of thinking and moving, but I think it's very slow. And so I think the opportunity to really circle in and focus in and fix a lot of what's happening on the student data collection front is a real opportunity that both state and federal policymakers should jump on.
Right. What about the military? Because you raise the question of what risks is posed to military bases just based on pure proximity. Have you seen anything on the military end of a concern about this?
Unfortunately not. And I certainly the American military overseas, they have their own kind of education system. And that is replete with its own problems as well. But I don't think that there has been much concern that I have seen about public schools in proximity to American-based military bases. And perhaps there is, and I'm not aware of it. Maybe it is, maybe it's classified. But I have not seen the military engaging on this issue whatsoever.
Okay, interesting. All right. Well, kind of a closing question then. What do you see? How do you see this issue of foreign influence fitting in with the broader spectrum of reform efforts and concerns that people have? Are there are these all disparate voices over different issues, or are there reform efforts or dialogue going on that are sort of putting these things together? Because we see anti-Semitism now, we see basic performance issues, we see disciplinary issues, we see, you know, other culture war issues. How are all of those playing into also this? What does that mosaic look like in terms of, you know, the landscape with among parents and even reform-minded educators?
I mean, I think it is, you know, it started with COVID, where there really was kind of a fracturing of trust between families and schools. I mean, at the beginning of COVID, my husband used to do school choice work, and I was working in higher ed at the time. And I had all these friends reach out and say, no, I don't want my school to close. How do I make them stay open? And I thought, oh, you know, bless your heart, you think they care. And I think that was, you know, I'm cynical, right? I was a libertarian. And so this was like kind of a ha-ha to me, but I think for so many people, it was such a wake-up call. It was such a shock that they don't really have a voice in this, that they're not, they may be a consumer, but they're not a customer in this process. And so that their input doesn't matter. And so, you know, from COVID to vaccines, to curriculum, to gender, to race, to kind of all these things, schools do absolutely everything, be emotional support animals for our children, but not teach them, but not keep our kids safe, but not tell us when there are drug overdoses, but like just all these different things. Trust, I think, between families and the school system is very, very badly frayed. And I think this should be yet another one of the ways and one of the reasons that schools open up and give families a little bit more transparency in order to start to rebuild that relationship, right? Like if your spouse cheats on you, right? I want access to your phone. I want to know who you're talking to so that I can start to trust you again. I want to be able to trust the public school system. I'm not trying to destroy the public school system, because even if we waved a magic wand tomorrow and there was universal school choice, there would still be children in a public school system. I mean, that's just the reality of the situation. And so how do we make families okay with where they're sending their kids to school? And how do we make the schools realize, okay, I have to maybe be a little bit more responsible and responsive to families' concerns? You know, at the end of the day, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so can you imagine the hysteria if we had, you know, Iran and Russia and the, you know, various conservative foundations throwing money at DC public schools? Like there would be an outcry. Yet we don't see that kind of outcry right now with China and progressive foundations dumping money into public schools. Why is that? You know, and again, we are seeing schools change and, you know, de-emphasize or spend different, you know, finite time with our children on things that are not essential to what parents expect. If my kid is spending 8 hours a day doing social emotional learning, then they're really not going to be good at math. My son is not reading at grade level because all he does is talk about his feelings. What is that? That's a betrayal. And so I think it is, you know, families very much, this is, you know, again, spans partisan lines. They want schools to get back to the basics. And so for families to be able to trust and really believe that schools are doing that, I think there needs to just be more honesty in this and not this continual keeping parents at arm's length about all of these issues.
Right. Right. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us today. You know, it's impressive, the research that you're doing, and hopefully you keep it up and yeah, you make some changes.
No, and I mean, everything we have done is we have built on your research that you guys have done over the years. And so thank you, I mean, for getting the ball rolling. And I can't wait until your report comes out next year.
Well, I'll do you one better. Thank you for being here today. And with that, I think we'll close it out. Please stick around for the next one. We have an ongoing series with this, and we'll see you next time.
Right, sweet. Thank you all. Bye.